So tonight we're going to be looking at first some religious, military, monastic orders. This is interesting and again still relevant today. I kind of mentioned at the end last week that we still talk about some of these groups, kind of mostly with conspiracy theories and things like that, but these groups started and were prevalent with the Crusades and sometime after. But one part of the Crusades that still has interest today are the religious, military, monastic orders that were created during this time for the Crusades. And they are described that way, religious, military, monastic orders, because they are both religious, they are military, so they have a religious purpose. They are military in nature in that these are warriors. They train as fighters, but they are also monks. And the most important of those orders, there were certainly others, but these are the ones that are most important, are the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, the Knights of the Temple, and the Teutonic Knights. Those are the three that we're going to talk about. So one of the things that these monastic orders did was they took the monastic life and they mixed it with chivalry. And they put those together in order to have these monk knights that served, especially during the Crusades. Now, largely, the purpose of these particular groups was to transport pilgrims safely to the Holy Land, give them shelter and protection while there, and do battle with the Muslim Turks. Now, the different groups emphasized kind of different aspects of that. Some were more about the fighting, some were more about the transporting, some were, that kind of thing. And there's one group that we're going to talk about that really didn't have anything to do with what was going on in the Middle East at all. The majority of their fighting was someplace else. But the Knights of St. John were the first group that we're going to talk about, and they actually start before the Crusades in 1048. And they weren't really as important or influential until the Crusades began, and that's why they're linked with that. Pope Paschal II gave them official recognition as a church order in 1113, and they were often known as Hospitallers. 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 And the reason that they had that nickname is because they ran a hospital for sick pilgrims in Jerusalem. So oftentimes when you're going from one place to another, especially when you're traveling like this and you don't have antibiotics, you're walking or riding on a boat, you can go a long way and you get to Jerusalem and you're sick. And again, a lot of people we've talked about, even the Crusaders would die of different diseases and different things. Well, this particular group set up a hospital, and so they were known as Hospitallers. The Knights of the Temple are the second group, and they were founded in 1118, just after the First Crusade. And their name came from the fact that their base was near the site of the Jerusalem Temple. It was near the site of the Jerusalem Temple. Now, there was something about this particular group that kind of we've already talked about, and that's they went by the monastic rules written by Bernard of Clairvaux. Now, remember, we talked a lot about Bernard of Clairvaux and his influence. And they came to be known as the Templars or the Templars, depending on how people pronounce it. But you have today the The Templars are talked about. This is the one that, that again, Dan Brown used in his Da Vinci Code. They usually talk about this particular group as kind of a secret order that after they were disbanded, which we'll talk about here in just a second, that they continued on in secret and kept the secrets of the Vatican and all that kind of thing. Of course, all that's nonsense, but that's what's put out there. So the Knights of St. John, as well as the Knights of the Temple, they certainly fought in the Crusades, and they fought with great courage and discipline. Because of all of this, they actually accumulated a good bit of wealth, because as they defeated the Turkish armies, of course, they would get the spoils of war, and they just grew as, and of course, different people would hire them in order to transport them from one place to another and take care of them in various areas. And so they certainly gained in wealth. Now, after Jerusalem was recaptured by Saladin in the Third Crusade, both of these groups, the Knights of St. John as well as the Templars, moved their headquarters to Acre. And remember, we talked about Acre. That was the more strategic city because it was on the trade routes. But they obviously had to move away from Jerusalem because Jerusalem had been recaptured. And then finally, when Acre fell in 1291, both of those organizations moved out of the Middle East. I mean, they basically had to because they didn't have any foothold there. The Hospitallers continued to defend Christian Europe against Muslim attack for the next 300 years. So they continued on for quite some time. And the Muslims did continue to put pressure on Europe. And so they were needed at various times. The Templars settled in France and continued there until 1312. And in what many consider one of the worst crimes of the Middle Ages, the French King Philip the Fair forcibly disbanded the Templars, put many of them, not most of them, to death, and he charged them with heresy. And this was not because they really were heretics. It was because he wanted their money and property. And so all of that was taken away. And hence the conspiracy theories, that people escaped, they went off into hiding and, that sort of thing. The third group is the Teutonic Knights. And the Teutonic Knights were a bit different than the Hospitallers and the Templars. And one of the ways that they were different is they were a German order of monk knights. A German order of monk knights founded by merchants of the German cities of Lubeck and Bremen in 1190 during the Third Crusade. So this one's a little bit later than the other two that we've talked about. They were given recognition by the Pope, Pope Clement III, pretty fast, about a year after they were formed in 1191. But most of their activities took place in Germany and Eastern Europe rather than in Palestine. They campaigned against the pagan Prussians, not Russians, Prussians, German groups there in 1226 in what's modern-day Poland. And they finally conquered the Prussians in 1283. Dominican missionaries followed, and Prussia was brought under the control of the Catholic Church at that time. So obviously the Teutonic Knights were influential in that particular area of the world. And of course, Poland today is still strongly Catholic. In fact, it's one of the Christian bastions that's one of the only Christian bastions that's left in Europe at this particular time. So that influence has continued. Similar was done by the Teutonic Knights in Latvia and Estonia, or what's now Latvia and Estonia. And in that same area of Lithuania was one of the last pagan holdouts against Christianity. One of the last pagan holdouts against Christianity. And in fighting against the Teutonic Knights, the Lithuanian king sought military assistance from the Queen of Catholic Poland. And the terms of the alliance were that the king of Lithuania would marry the Queen of Poland and unite the empire, and all the Lithuanians would become Christians. And of course, the reason that the Polish were doing that is because the Teutonic Knights were the ones who conquered them, so they didn't really care for the Teutonic Knights. But in that particular way, the Lithuanians became Christian, and the Teutonic Knights were kept out of Lithuania, and the kind of the last pagan area of Europe at that time was finally Christianized. And we say Christianized, whether they were Christian or not, is probably pretty doubtful, but that at least became the official religion at the time. So those are those three groups. There were others, but they were certainly important. And again, the Templars at least are still talked a lot about today. All right, last thing as far as the Crusades is concerned is let's talk about some of the effects of the Crusades. First of all, the Crusades heightened the influence of the papacy in Western Europe. It heightened the influence of the papacy in Western Europe. So the Crusades made the papacy appear as the champions of Christianity. Since they were the ones who inspired the Crusades, they were the ones who would call them. And so because of that particular influence, they gained in popularity and prestige and power. Now, of course, all of this is building up until you get to the Reformation. So just keep that in mind as the Pope gains in power. It's going to finally lead to a turning point. A second effect of the Crusades was that the Crusades encouraged the use of indulgences within the church. They encouraged the use of indulgences with the church. Of course, they started out to pardon the temporal penalties of sin for a great act. We talked about that, like serving in the Crusades. And then they turned into just a direct entrance into heaven after that. But they soon came to be sold for cash in return for canceled penalties. And so as the practice of indulgences continued on, they branched out from the Crusades to other people so that people could buy the forgiveness of their sins, or to not go to purgatory, or to get somebody else out of purgatory early, however it was. But the point is that this particular practice of the indulgence, the doing an act or selling or giving cash in order to have your sins forgiven in some way, increased. And again, I'm telling you that because we're going to get to the Reformation, and it's going to come to a head. And indulgences is going to be something that becomes important.
The peasant didn't have a chance.
What's that?
A peasant didn't have a chance.
No, you're right. They didn't really, except to give up maybe their life savings in order to try to get somebody out of purgatory, grandma or something, whoever it was. Yeah. There were situations of, kind of indentured servitude and things like that would happen because of that in order to pay for it. So, it was a system that preyed on the ignorance of the people at the time as far as the Bible is concerned in order to get money. And of course that just increases. I mean, once you start doing that more and more, there was a building project that needed to be done in the Vatican. For example, the building of St. Peter's Basilica. And so what do? You crank up the indulgence train and get people out there selling indulgences, and that's how you gain money. So it was a very, very devious way of getting money. Third, the Crusades helped establish the idea of war as a practice to destroy the enemies of the Catholic Church. It helped establish the idea of war as a practice to destroy the enemies of the Catholic Church. Now, this had already been, to some extent, ideas that were out there. If you disagree with somebody, you just kill them. Which, by the way, we're kind of returning to that, aren't we? I mean, the more and more you disagree with somebody, now you just hate them. You don't sit down and have a discussion with them. Thankfully, we're not. At least the killing has not been widespread, but it certainly has happened. But more and more from this point forward, and we talked about with Bernard of Clairvaux how he had the idea of sitting down and talking with people. The Crusades just pushed the idea of if you disagree with them, you just kill them. And that becomes more of something that happens with the Inquisitions that we're going to talk about, with the movement to the New World, when the Spanish and Portuguese and others come to the New World, it was largely the practice that if the natives didn't conform to Christianity, well, you just wipe them out. And the Crusades had influence on that. I'm not saying that the Crusades started that. I am saying that there was influence there. Fourth, the Crusades helped develop strong monarchies in Western Europe. They helped develop strong monarchies in Western Europe. The nobility, so remember that you had certainly monarchs, you had kings, queens, that sort of thing. But under them you had the nobles. And so the power structure was spread out a little bit. The kings didn't have complete power because they had to please the nobles that were under them. But as more and more nobles got caught up in the Crusades and left their lands in order to go fight in the Crusades, many of them dying of famine or disease or fighting, then it left a hole of a vacuum back in Europe. And instead of appointing or having more nobles come up, the monarchies begin to pull up that power. That they begin to take that power for their own. And so that's how the monarchies begin to get stronger and stronger. They don't have to share the power as much with the nobility under them.
So they just took back over the land that they had given them.
Yeah, I mean they really hadn't given it to them, but they, the nobles would serve under the king and they would have kind of their own land. But the king saw this as an opportunity to then grab up that land for themselves, and then
they had an own army,
mm-hmm.
land too. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the nobles would have a smaller, group of soldiers that they had, or at least farmers who they would train to fight and things like that. That all begins to be more and more consolidated. Exactly. Fifth, the Crusades brought further lasting damage between the Western Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Further and lasting damage. Remember that we talked about with the Crusades that the Western Catholics went down, took over those areas in Palestine of the 4 Latin kingdoms, and they took over the Orthodox churches there and made them Catholic churches. Well, of course, the Orthodox didn't like that. Then you've got the Fourth Crusade that we spoke of last week, where the Western Catholics come and attack Constantinople and loot the churches and stuff that are there. So all of that just divided further the relationship between the Western Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. And then finally, the Crusades led to a bitter hatred between Christians and Muslims. Led to a bitter hatred between Christians and Muslims. Now, up until this particular time, of the time of the Crusades, Christians and Muslims, although there was animosity, between the two, they largely lived together. The Muslims, as we've talked about, did make the Christians second-class citizens. That was certainly true. But oftentimes the Christians would just live under that. They would just say, well, this is our home. This is where our family is. We'll just live as we live. So there wasn't the strong animosity. Now, there was fighting from the Byzantine Empire against the Muslims and the Frankish Empire against the Muslims, but that was more nationalistic than it was religious. It's really because of the Crusades that you begin to have a hatred between the Christians and the Muslims. And that continues today. That particular hatred, as far as Muslims are concerned, they're still taught about the things that took place in the Crusades. And while that was a long time ago, as we've talked about, there were some atrocious acts that Christians perpetrated on Muslim women and children and non-combatants that were there in those particular areas. Now, did it go the reverse? Well, of course it did. But, when you're talking about, particular groups, you tend to emphasize what the other group did to you, not what you did to the other group. That's where a lot of that animosity came from. And then you do have good examples like Saladin. And again, we talked about how Saladin was actually a better example of Christian morality than for the Christians, largely. So, all of that played into it. And of course, another part to that was that the Western Christians, through the Crusades, didn't do evangelism at all. The purpose of the Crusades was not to evangelize the Muslim populations. It was to execute them or to push them out. And so because of that, there was, Christianity was not spread to them so that they understood it. All they saw of Christianity was a military force coming against them. And all of that played into that clash. Yeah, I mean, they saw the cross as a military instrument.
Not what I want.
Instead of, something that would bring salvation to them. Absolutely. All right, so that brings us to the end of the time of the Crusades. Any thoughts or ideas you want to talk about with the Crusades?
Well, the summary you just gave, it matches the prevailing attitude, which was if they disagreed, kill them.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
there was
Yeah.
no evangelism.
Correct. And, it's very much like, I remember sitting with a group of Muslim men, and they brought up religion. I mean, we were told not to bring it up unless they brought it up. If they brought it up, you can talk about it. So they start talking about various differences, and they were asking kind of our opinion on things, and we said, well, one of the differences between Islam and Christianity is that we don't force people to become Christians, at least not anymore. And their response was, well, we don't force people to become Christians. And we said, to become Muslims. And we said, is that really the case? And they said, oh, absolutely. Your choice is you can become a Muslim or you can die. You have a choice.
Don't force them.
Yeah, we don't force them. You've got a choice. And we said, well, we don't really view that as a very good choice, in that. But remember, there was a time where, again, Christian groups, or at least groups that called themselves Christian, did the very same thing. So, yeah. All right. Now, we are going to move back east and take a trip to Russia.
Oh, I never want to go there.
Well, too bad. You are on the plane. I was going to say train, but there's an ocean, so have to take a plane. You need one?
Maybe. I'm trying to keep up with it.
All right, we're not going to spend as much time on this particular subject as we have some of the other ones, just because a lot of the details are not as influential or important, but I didn't want to skip this particular part, because when you're talking about ideas in the headlines today, this has importance for what we're seeing right now in the world. There is a reason that the Russians want Ukraine, and it involves this. And so when you understand this, then you can understand why Vladimir Putin wants Kyiv. Why does he want Ukraine? It's because it's baked into their history. This is a part of who they are. So that's one of the things that I want you to see as we go through this. So you'll begin to see that as we talk about it. So we've talked about the spread of the two main forms of Christianity into the various parts of the world, Western Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox. And those various groups not only moved east and west, but they also moved, especially in this case, north. We just talked about how there was influence with the Western Catholics into Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, those particular areas in that region of, what was, almost the Scandinavian area of Russia up in that direction. But there was also influence from the Eastern Orthodox Church moving up into those Slavic areas of Northern Europe and West Asia. So it's in Eastern Europe that a very large Christian church emerged that is now the largest Orthodox church, which is the Russian Orthodox Church, which is another reason we wanted to talk about it. I mean, if we're going to talk about the Western Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, we've got to talk about the Russians, because the Greek Orthodox, although that's what, kind of the area around Constantinople or Istanbul today, kind of centers in that area, the largest Eastern group is the Russian Orthodox as far as population is concerned. So in the 10th century, that's the 900s, the Byzantine Church began to make contact with the Russian city of Kyiv, or Kiev. I'm going to call it Kyiv. When I was growing up, they called it Kiev, but I do think the correct pronunciation is Kyiv, or at least the very best we can do in our English, trying to speak Ukrainian. And this led to the founding of the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, Kyiv was the most powerful and prosperous city among the Russians at the time in the 10th century. The tribal group were known as the Rus, R-U-S, the Rus, which is, of course, where you get the name Russian, or the country Russia. It's because the people group are the Rus. Now, they were pagan religiously. They seem to be related to the Norsemen of Scandinavia in a lot of ways. The Rus encouraged trade with the Byzantine Empire to the south. And so that began to open up Kiev to influence from the Orthodox Church. So if you have trade, then of course along with that trade you're going to have missionaries. And missionaries go along with the traders up to Kiev and begin to evangelize up there. By 945, there's a church that's established in the city of Kiev. 945. So, just think about today. That means that for over 1,000 years, there's been a church in Kiev. The Russian princess, Olga, of course, you probably could have guessed that her name was Olga. The Russian princess Olga, who ruled in Kiev from 945 to 964, while her son, Svetoslav, excuse my pronunciation of Russian names, but he was just a child, and so his mother Olga ruled in his place until he grew older. She was the first royalty to convert to Christianity and receive baptism in 957. But that didn't change the Rus yet, didn't lead to their Christianization. It was when Olga's son became ruler it didn't change then. When her son became the ruler, took over, when he was old enough, he was afraid that the pagan warriors of the Rus would laugh at him for becoming a Christian. He was kind of embarrassed if that were so. So he didn't go with his mother's faith. So Christianity really did not take hold in Kiev until Olga's grandson, Vladimir, again, you probably could have guessed that too, began to rule in 980. And so that's when Christianity takes hold. Now, Russian tradition states that Vladimir, the grandson of Olga, invited representatives from the 4 great religions of the world at the time. The 4 great religions of the world, and they were Judaism, Islam, Catholic Christianity, and Orthodox Christianity. Now, I know that we would say that the Catholics and the Orthodox are certainly related there, but they were 2 different churches, 2 different organizations. And so they were all supposedly invited to come to Kiev and explain their different faiths. Judaism and Islam did not impress Vladimir at all, but he was intrigued by the different forms of Christianity. So he sent delegates to Rome and to Constantinople in order to investigate more, to learn more from these different groups. And eventually the scales tipped onto the side of the Orthodox Christians in the East, because delegates had entered, John, the Church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople that we've talked about so much. And when they entered there, they witnessed Byzantine worship. And when they came back and described it to Vladimir, they said that during that time, with the beauty of that building and the worship that was taking place around them, they were not sure whether they were in heaven or on earth. And because it was so beautiful, they said, all we know is that God dwells with these people.
Icons, John.
Yeah, icons.
Did it.
Now, it is, I will say, a magnificent thing Or it should be the way it is, that when people spend time with us, that they walk away saying, God is with those people. But maybe not necessarily just because of the way the building looks and, the ornateness of various things. But that particular idea becomes important with Russian Orthodoxy. And the reason it becomes important is because typically with the Russian Orthodox Church, they tend to prize beauty in the form of their worship over doctrinal orthodoxy. In other words, if it's pretty, that's more important than being doctrinally right and moral. That's not the direction that we necessarily want to go. Having things that are beautiful and, all that's very nice. I think one of the things that we've lost in oftentimes in Protestant Christianity is some of the art factor of Christianity that some of the other groups have. Now, I don't think we need to have the icons and worship them and stuff like that, but I do think that there's something that's missing there. Because that art has a place, but we never want to sacrifice that for right teaching, right doctrine. And oftentimes that's the way that kind of works. Well, Vladimir was convinced that Eastern Christianity was the form he would follow, and he embraced it in 988. He embraced Eastern Christianity. And when the king becomes a Christian, many of the Rus followed his example and were baptized as well. So Vladimir then seeks to make Kiev a Christian Kiev in the model of Constantinople. The Patriarch of Constantinople appointed a metropolitan bishop to Kiev to lead the Russian church. And that's what the leader becomes known as, a metropolitan in the Russian Orthodox Church there. So when I talk about a metropolitan, I'm talking about a bishop that's appointed there. Vladimir marries Anna, the sister of the great Byzantine Emperor Basil II, and invites Byzantine monks in order to come and settle in Kiev. And these monks begin to translate the Byzantine liturgy, which is the forms of worship, the orders of worship, things like that, things that are used in worship. I begin to translate all of that into the Slavic language using the Cyrillic alphabet. We've talked about the Cyrillic alphabet. Remember back Cyril of Thessalonica and his brother Methodius, two Byzantine Christians who created the Cyrillic alphabet in order to spread Christianity to the Rus back in the 800s. So we've already talked about that. We just kind of mentioned it briefly, but it was important. Now, this was an advantage to Eastern Christianity over the Western Christians, because in Western Catholic Christianity, you had to speak in Latin. They didn't allow you to speak in the native language of your people. But Eastern Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, allowed you to do that. And so the scriptures and the liturgies and everything else were translated, all the different church writings were translated into the Russian language so the people could speak it. And Vladimir did a lot in order to spread Christianity in the area. I mean, he had a highly organized system of services to the poor. He set up schools to train younger generations in the faith. I mean, he was all in as far as Christianity was concerned. He wanted to spread the faith. Now, something else during this time, and these are the early days of Russian Orthodox Christianity, there was a distinct Russian style of church building that came into existence. You've seen it before. There's these towers with an onion-shaped dome that's at the top of them. Those are still prominent today. When you see pictures of Moscow and you see those onion-shaped tops of towers. Those are Russian Orthodox churches. And again, you see that influence still there today. Okay, that's where we got to stop for tonight. We'll talk about what happens after Vladimir and how do we get from Kiev to Moscow. We'll talk about that in all of this. But at least at this point, just realize that the roots of the Rus people, where do they start? In Kiev, not Moscow. So that right there is going to tell you something. Why do the Russians want Kiev? It's because that's the birthplace of the Russian people. They want it back. And so still causing wars today. All right, any questions or anything on what we've talked about so far with the Russian Orthodox? All right, before we dismiss, I do want to show you a new church history work if you're interested in reading more about Christian history that has just come out. This is hot off the presses. It is called Christian History, Volume 1. Pretty easy to figure out what that's all about. From the Apostolic Fathers to the eve of the Reformation. Now, this is not nearly as detailed as a lot of the things that we've talked about, but it does cover the major eras from the apostles going up to the beginnings of the Reformation. And one of the reasons I'm showing you this one is that it's pretty well written. It's good reading. It's fairly easy reading as far as church history texts go. Although I still like this one, Nick Needham's is probably the best I've read, and it's 5 volumes now, and I think there's supposed to be a 6th one that comes out. So it's a lot more detailed. But this one is written by my church history professor that I had in seminary. His name's Steve McKinnon. It was his first year of teaching at seminary when I had him, and now he's old. So, let that tell you something. He's been there for a long time. I think I had him in 2001, 2002, something like that. So, he's been teaching at Southeastern Seminary since then. But good guy.
What is the Needham volume? What is it called?
Nick Needham, 2,000 Years of Christ's Power. And again, there's 5 I think it's 5 volumes right now, and then there's supposed to be a 6th volume. He is Scottish, I believe. But he's one of the interesting things about both of these is that both of these are written by Baptists. And that's actually a rarity when it comes to church history volumes. At least I'll say good church history. Yeah, they come from more of a Protestant Baptist perspective. I mean, although church history is church history. I mean, you know, if you get it right, you get it right. It doesn't matter. Justo Gonzalez has a 2-volume set that's really good. He's Catholic, and I like his too. Use those in seminary. But he does a pretty good job as well. All right. If there's nothing else, let's pray and we'll be dismissed. Heavenly Father, just thank you for the things that we've looked at. Lord, certainly the influence of both the Crusades and the Russian Orthodox Church, Lord, have influence on our time today, our world today. And so we see more and more as we get closer and closer to our time just how these things have affected our daily lives, the things that we see in the news and things like that. Lord, again, I pray that we would learn these and be able to apply them to our own lives. And Lord, maybe help people to understand a lot of the reasons why things are happening the way they are in the world in which we live. And then use that as a springboard to teach them about the truths of Christ. And Lord, what is right as far as what you teach us. And so, Lord, just pray that we would be the witnesses that we need to be, and wherever we are. And I pray that you would bless us as we go. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.